Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Now, if you've been listening in the last few months, you'll know that I've been doing various features on the development of the Nazi camp system, particularly from the works of Nicholas Froschmann and his brilliant book KL, A History of the Nazi Camps, which if you haven't read it already, you really should. But we're our way through the book. We focused mainly on the development of the camp, the careers of various camp administrators and guards, and the kind of the sociology really of the SS. But now I want to focus more on the day-to-day experience of prisoners in the camps, particularly as we've seen. The life for prisoners became the system of the camps became more and more coordinated, and so as the camps moved from chaos, which was an accurate description of their first kind of inception, to a more ordered system, so the treatment of prisoners changed as well. So a more standardised system emerged in the mid-1930s for dealing with prisoners. The various contours of the different camps began to sort of iron out, and a standardised camp system emerged, along with the careers, progression of the staff and their backgrounds. But also, the prisoners experienced greater kind of uniformity, and, for example, their appearance. So by 1936, their hair was shaved off on arrival, and that happened at regular intervals thereafter, partly to make sure that issues of lice didn't become too much of a problem, but also to show that anyone who had a shaved head and who was outside the camp could be easily identified as a prisoner. And of course it was a tactic for dehumanisation, for stripping away identity. And also, about 1938, the identical uniforms began to come in as well. It used to be, before that a kind of a mishmash of civilian clothes, old police garments would be generally what the prisoners would wear. You see old photographs of them wearing kind of jumpers and ill-fitting trousers. But by the late 1930s, the blue and grey stripes, the zebra uniform, which was blue and white in the summer and blue and grey in winter, with numbers stitched onto the jackets and the trousers, was introduced. That's around 1938. So in the smaller camps, guards had once sort of spoken to the inmates directly by name, but in the larger camps of the late 1930s, prisoners were then reduced to numbers, and they would simply be referred to as a number. Now, even though prisoner life was standardised and prisoner appearance was standardised, it didn't mean to say that different groupings and hierarchies didn't emerge from within the prison system. There were some prisoners who were better fed, better groomed, better accommodated, and better dressed than others. And these were normally the capos, the prisoners who policed other prisoners. Between 1937 and 1938, the system of triangles was introduced. For example, red triangles for political prisoners, pink triangles for gay men in the prison system, and other triangles for different kind of denotations of crimes. And this had a huge impact on prisoner lives and how they would survive the prison system. The day-to-day lives of prisoners varied radically. Schedules would often vary depending on what time of year it was, and what year it was, in fact. The SS liked to remind the prisoners that they were master over every aspect of their lives, and particularly over the question of time. So the ability to make daily life unpredictable, so that the inmates were constantly anxiously worrying what was going to happen next and what was going to happen to them next, was a key part of the regime of terror. Routine, anything out of the routine is frightening. It can involve punishments, it can involve extra work, it can involve hardship, and hardship can be fatal. And abuse can be spontaneous. Now, in previous podcasts, we've talked about how Theodor Eich, the head of the camp system, liked to ensure that there was sadism, but that sadism was that which fell into certain disciplines and boundaries. Well, having unpredictability, having the SS guards storm into barrack blocks and beat everybody up, or throw belongings onto the floor, or bring about random punishments. That was a way of introducing chaos into the prisoners' lives, to constantly keep them on their toes and constantly keep them in a state of anxiety. Days were broken into segments, and these were marked by bells or sirens, which would be heard all the way across the camp. And this was, part of the regime brought in from the army, because of course the Nazis had this fantasy that if Germany was run like a barracks, then there would be some kind of change to the nature, the culture, society, through this constant sort of regimentation and militarization. So the day begins at about 4 a.m. or perhaps even earlier, and prisoners would be allowed to splash a bit of water on their face or their bodies, eat some porridge, and have a thin, watery kind of ersatz sort of coffee. Quickly wash their plates and store them. These are the kinds of things that you don't want going walkabout, because if you haven't got a bowl the next time you come to the canteen, then you're going to go hungry. And then they would make their beds. They would have to be out of their quarters and march to roll call very quickly, silently, and in a military manner. And roll call could be agonising. Weak prisoners would have to be supported by their comrades, and nobody missed roll call. The SS would verify the number, and if there are any mistakes, prisoners would have to stand for a very long time, several hours, until there were checks made and the whereabouts of people supposedly missing from roll call were accounted for. There would be loudspeaker announcements, normally announcing new kinds of restrictions or punishments or threats. And block leaders would sometimes be punished in front of the rest of the prisoners for example, having some of their people they were responsible for being slumped or having poor posture. Prisoners would be then split into labour battalions, labour details, and marched away quickly, sometimes to work outside the compound, and sometimes to work within it. So they would be often outsourced to local businesses to give them free labour, and these would be people who would be supplying all sorts of favours, kickbacks and corruption to the camp in order for this resource that the camp had managed to capture. Most of the daytime hours of the prisoners would be taken up with work. There'd be a brief lunch, which would be some kind of vegetable stew, normally very watery, with bread, and most of the prisoners would constantly be feeling hunger. Now, it's unlikely to say in any of the camps before the war that there's starvation, but there's constant hunger. Food is sort of just about tolerable. By and large, the amount of calories per day that a German camp prisoner would be surviving on would be sufficiently better than most of the inmates of the gulags in the Soviet Union at this time. But in both cases, there's not, even in the Soviet Union, there aren't instances of mass starvation in the camps, but there is constant acute hunger most of the time. The prisoners were able to supplement their daily rations. Relatives were prevented from sending food, but they could transfer little sums of money to the prisoners to give them additional supplies from the SS-run canteens. At Dachau, for example, an inmate who gained 4 Reichsmarks a week in 1938 could buy half a pound of butter, half a pound of biscuits, a tin of herring or sardines, some artificial honey, a few personal items like soap, shoelaces or toothpaste, a few dozen cubes of sugar, and 2 packs of cigarettes, which of course would have made an unofficial currency amongst the other inmates. At the evening roll call, following the return of all the labour details, the men would stand exhausted and had to stand to attention, no matter what the weather was, until the SS counted everybody. The SS would often enjoy dragging this out because knowing how in what physical pain and exhaustion the prisoners were in, and they would sometimes force the prisoners to sing songs or make them watch punishments, beatings, other punishments take place, and then the prisoners would be able to go off and eat in their quarters, normally some more watery soup and bread, and then they would perhaps have to perform more chores within the compound, such as cleaning uniforms and sweeping up and doing various manual jobs. Prisoners could be dragged out of their own spare time, what little of that there was, and private conversations were forbidden nearly throughout most of the day, so seeing prisoners stopping chatting was a punishable offence. But in the evening, in the barracks, prisoners could get together and talk. The only thing they could read would be Nazi newspapers, which they had to purchase themselves. And then at about 9 o'clock, the prisoners would be inside their quarters, and then sirens would go off and lights would go out. So really the prisoners' lives were one endless cycle of non-stop physical hard labour, with anybody leaving their barrack blocks at night would face the death penalty. And then the next day would be the same cycle of endless physical labour. Some days there was some let up from this, and the labour wasn't at the centre stage then. The SS is still obviously in control on Sundays, but there would be sometimes longer roll calls. But the chance to do things that didn't involve hard physical labour for a few hours was there, such as the establishment of prison orchestras to perform for the SS, and there were religious Sunday services as there were in most prisons. In Dachau, the SS sometimes allowed in local priests to celebrate Mass on the roll call square, and this obviously grinds to a halt in the mid-1930s when the Nazi regime fights its own bitter feud with the Catholic Church, and eventually Himmler prevents this practice altogether. And of course, SS men took time off on Sundays, meaning that the total number of guards available had declined, and so that was possibly gave the prisoners slightly greater license to try to find a moment of free time. So they were able to read or play board games or have a little bit of downtime. For example, and I quote here Nicholas Waschmann, he says, "When Hans Litten was moved from Lichtenberg to Buchenwald in 1937, he had to send home his entire collection of books. You can well imagine what that means to me. he wrote to his mother in despair. Lytton now had to rely on rudimentary camp libraries that had sprung up since 1933, sometimes funded with monies extorted from prisoners. Though the SS purchased plenty of propaganda tracts, there were enough books, almost 6,000 titles in Buchenwald by autumn 1939, to include the occasional gem. So inmates spent a lot of time, when they did have free time, writing letters to loved ones. They would be able to send a brief letter or postcard every other week. And this made this was on the condition and on the understanding that these letters would be censored, would be read. Anything that looked like criticism would have serious consequences, and simple letters would be something like, thank you for the money you've sent me, thank you for the letter, I am fine, I am well. Very bland, very nondescript. But all the more important because visits were almost impossible, and by the end of the 1930s, only allowed in exceptional circumstances. Withheld letters or delayed letters caused great alarm and distress among relatives who assumed the worst. In 1938, Nicholas Waschmann writes, the wife of a Dachau prisoner contacted the commandant's office asking bluntly, have you shot my husband because no mail is arriving anymore? Clever hidden references, annotations, marks, whatever could be snuck into letters. Prisoners from early on in the camp system created their own artistic performances, which were sanctioned by the SS, but sometimes could be subversive. For an example of this would be a theatre performance of acrobatics and dance and music known as the Circus Concentricani that was held at the Bergamo camp in 1933 that had songs in and jokes about the SS men, some of whom who didn't quite get that they were the butt of the jokes, some who watched in disbelief at this daring display of defiance. And these were very, very few and far between. They were punished severely, and it was something that the SS were themselves punished for by their authorities, as boundaries between the prisoners and guards started to be blurred by these acts. Prisoners wouldn't always ask permission for these kinds of cultural gang shows, but there would also be secret religious and political meetings happening in the camps, often under the cover of night. One of the systems that was used most regularly in the camp system towards the end of the 1930s was the use of capos, or using prisoners as surrogate guards. Himmler referred to this as a system for holding down subhumans. Himmler said, and I quote Nicholas Waschmann, a few select inmates, Himmler explained, forced others to work hard, keep clean and make their beds. These prisoners' supervisors were known, Himmler added, as the so-called capos. The term capo had derived from the Italian term capo, C-A-P-O, or head or leader. It's a term we used in kind of mafia terminology as the capo de capo, the boss of bosses. And this is where the term came from. And the camp machinery came to rely on capos more and more. In the pre-war camp system, it had become so effective that the Nazis eventually interjected this into Jewish ghettos. It was a great system for dividing and ruling, and into the slave labour camps and the death camps later on. The capo system predated Nazism, however. So to start with, the capos had been essentially trustees in German prisons. Rudolf Höss, for example, when he had been in prison for murder, had been a trustee clerk at Brandenburg prison in 1927. And so many of the the camp inmates, had previously been inside Nazi prisons. They already understood the system. They already knew the system of assuming influential posts. And here again, I quote Nicholas Vashman. "We arrived from the penitentiary," one communist activist later described his arrival in Buchenwald, and we used to a comrade serving as a trustee. What distinguished the KL was not the deployment of prisoners as such, but the powers some capos gained. So Theodor Eicke, who would have thought of himself as the founder of the capo system, was not its creator. And the truth of the matter was that perhaps nobody was actually the creator of the capo system. It was something that kind of emerged between the prisoners themselves, and then a kind of a consensus between the prisoners and the guards. Obviously, becoming a capo was quite an attractive job for a prisoner because it meant perks and privileges. Initially, some prisoners wanted there to be a kind of a block leader who would sort out grievances, who would deal with problems, who would make sure that people that weren't pulling their weight pulled it so that everybody else wasn't punished. And this suddenly was noticed by prison authorities and later by the Nazis as being an effective way of running and managing things. Of course, the thing about the capos under the Nazis is that they become enormously compromised, and they become allied to the regime, complicit in its crimes, and they become the means by which the Nazis divide and rule in the camp. The last thing the Nazis wanted emerging in the camp was any kind of solidarity. The system was deeply entrenched by the mid-1930s and grew as the camp's system expanded. What happened is best, sort of in inverted commas, best practice, be it to do with capos or anything else, would be copied and rolled out to other camps. At the end of 1938, when Buchenwald had about 11,000 prisoners, there were about 500 capos, and senior capos were appointed by the SS, though officers would often listen to proposals from prominent prisoners as to why they or one of their kind of friends should become a capo. And this almost formed a kind of a parallel organisational structure to the SS. So the capos would fall into three groups: work supervisors of labour details. There would be capos who supervised prisoner life and who would make sure there were no work-shy prisoners, that bunks were properly maintained, and that tidiness was properly maintained within barrack blocks. And then there were inmates who served as capos in camp administration. These were those who could read, write, who were good with accounts, that kind of thing. Those who had medical experience, who could work in infirmaries, and those who could work in storerooms and kitchens and that sort of thing. And these were attractive jobs that different groups within the camp would try to kind of monopolise, and particularly the communists made sure that the best jobs went to their own kind. Anyway, there's an awful lot more to say about camp life here, and we're going to continue looking at it, looking at camp life for gay and lesbian prisoners and for asocial prisoners. But again, I hope you found this useful and informative, and if you do, then if you would consider swinging by our Patreon page, we can always use a good friend out there to help us with the running costs of things. Anyway, thanks very much, and I look forward to speaking to you all again on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best, bye-bye.